Hello, BookTube. It's Tuesday, and that means it's time for Poetry Tuesday. I bet you thought I forgot about Poetry Tuesday. And maybe occasionally I have. But it's a feature that I want to do on this channel till the end of time. It's for those of you who are new, it's a feature where I read contemporary poetry, where we look at a poem together and think about it, talk about it together. I learn a lot in the comments field because I have for a long time maligned contemporary poetry as being lazy and narcissistic. So, in order to facilitate, getting a grip on it, I have decided with Poetry Tuesday, usually to go elsewhere than to poetry circles. I like to go places like the New Yorker or the London Review of Books where there are poems published, but where the venue, at least to me, hints that maybe those poems are not being published for other poets. Because if contemporary poetry is a genre that is only written for its own practitioners, I would appreciate it if it would come out and say that, so that I can just completely ignore it, and so can everyone else. But it doesn't do that. Instead, it trades on the high coinage of poetry as being the most refined and most important of all the genres. So if it's going to do that, it should be able to appear anywhere and be read by anybody. So that might be the wrong approach, but that's my approach, and towards that end, I'm going to read a poem. We're going to read today a poem that I found in the new TLS. Look at that cover, will you? That is Lucy Barron. Look at that. Isn't that lovely? It's Victoria looking down into a cup of tea, and she's also reflected in the spoon. That is just lovely. And it turns out that is a reflection of, no pun intended, of the opening article. The opening review is a multi-part review, a roundup. Those are very difficult to do well. It helps the more space you have, but even then, you've got to bridge the gap between the individual books. It's when you review more than one book on relatively the same subject or some kind of same heading, and it's tough to do because the bridges between the individual segments are all important, and they are tricky. And this is by Clarissa Campbell Orr, and it's 5 books about monarchy. And the first of the books is Miles Taylor's book's Empress, about Queen Victoria in India, which I absolutely loved. I praised it on this channel a few months ago and just thought it was fantastic. And so there's also Hugo Vickers reconstituted the notes of James Pope Hennessy, the biographer of Queen Mary. He reconstituted and made editorially curated Pope Hennessy's notes, his larger notes about researching his biography of Queen Mary, and made a book called The Quest for Queen Mary, which I still don't have. I still have not read it. I've read everything else about Queen Mary, and I have written a NaNoWriMo novel about her, but I haven't read this book. And one of the other books mentioned here is Queen of the World by Robert Hardman, about Queen Elizabeth II as the head of the Commonwealth, which I surprised myself by really liking. The piece also looks at Adrian Tinniswood's Behind the Throne, Lucinda Hawksley's Elizabeth Revealed, and Lucy Worsley's Queen Victoria, daughter, wife, mother, widow. And none of those 3 really did it for me. But I liked Queen of the World quite a bit. I'm very interested in reading The Quest for Queen Mary, and I thought that Empress by Miles Taylor was incredible. So of course I was gratified when Clarissa Campbell Orr starts her review this way. 2 centuries after her birth, there are still new things to say about Queen Victoria and her royal legacy. This sextet of studies of British and imperial monarchy each has something to offer. In Empress, Queen Victoria in India, the one masterpiece in the selection, Miles Taylor asserts that she was less a constitutional monarch and more a dynastic imperial ruler of the long 18th century. Very gratifying to hear the reviewer, for the very first review of the cover review of the TLS, call that book a masterpiece. I agree. Although Queen of the World also gets a fairly good review in this piece. And this issue had lots of interesting stuff in it. Really did. For instance, Jane Ridley, all of whose biographies I have read, does a long piece about what would have happened, what might have happened, if Queen Victoria had been born a boy. She imagines King Alexander. She imagines if everything else had been the same about the succession and all of that, and temperament, and the events of Queen Victoria's reign, only it had been a man instead of a woman. I thought it was fascinating. I don't usually go in for that sort of thing, but I really liked it. And there were a couple of other things here as well. Oh yes, Gregory Tate. Who is Gregory Tate? They tell you all about the writers at the back. He's a lecturer in Victorian literature in the University of St Andrews, and he does a long 2-page thing on Arthur Hugh Clough, who was a poet during the Victorian era and who was famous for, let's see, he does it here, the struggle. Say not the struggle of not availeth, which was quoted by Winston Churchill during World War II. And this is a piece about all sorts of the poet's other works. It's fascinating. I always wonder, when I see a 2-page thing like this, does this mean that Gregory Tate has a book coming out on Arthur Hugh Clough? I don't know. I'd be interested to see that. Of course, I know him from Rumpole. I know he is quoted by Rumpole in one very good Rumpole story. As I sat in the cafe, I thought to myself, they may talk all they like about what they call pelf. They may sneer as they please about eating and drinking, but I cannot help it. I cannot help thinking how pleasant it is to have money. Hey ho, how pleasant it is to have money. So pleasant it is to have money. That's the bubble reputation when Rumpole gets a wonderful per diem brief to defend Miss Amelia Nettleship, that prime bottler of historical bilge water. And then we get two pages of articles on Walt Whitman, and I think there's another 2-page. Yeah, the next 2 pages are 2 collections of lesser collected stories of 2 authors. That is interesting. There's one, The Case for Humanity and Other Stories, is a collection of previously uncollected or lesser collected prose of Rudyard Kipling. And the reviewer, Jan Montefiore, says that, let's see here, that this collection gives 86 hitherto obscure stories and sketches full information about the provenance and history of each. Pinney's editorial skills and depth of scholarship are everywhere visible in these pages, but Kipling's literary brilliance only fitfully. That tends to be the case when you reprint stuff like that. Then another 2-page spread, this time on John Ruskin. 2 whole pages of the TLS with the writers writing about John Ruskin. Didn't think anybody knew about John Ruskin anymore or cared, but there you go. But there was something else in here. There were a couple of other things in here that seemed of interest. There's a review in the fiction section of Being Various, a new anthology of Irish short stories that is edited by Lucy Caldwell that I have not seen and would very much like to see. Then there's a feature in the middle where a bunch of TLS contributors talk about the books that made them, the books that affected them in childhood. But where is, let's see here, as long as we're going on, let's just keep going on here. Review of a new biography of Tesla. Oh, here we go. John Waterbury, in this page here, reviews Fawaz Gerji's book, Making of the Arab World, which I really liked. And he doesn't like it quite so much. He seems to take it to task for all the things it didn't do, which always annoys me when a critic does that. And concludes by saying, the reader in search of a key to understanding the Arab world will be only partially satisfied by this book. The clash of Islam and military nationalists has been over power, deciding who would be the junior and senior partner. Both protagonists are profoundly non- and anti-democratic, and only one invokes God as an ally. And he finishes by saying that he doesn't finish by saying that, although maybe that the maker of that sound will encounter a low-hanging branch and decapitate himself. That I wouldn't object to that. He finishes by saying that the book leaves unanswered what could possibly change the grim situation in the Arab world. Yes, it does leave that unanswered, but it never wanted to answer that question, so I'm not sure how much you can hold against it. And then, all the way in the back, the TLS forever and ever has had the NB section, which is written by someone named JC, no attribution. And at the beginning of the NB this time around, JC notes that the Scottish Review of Books has been shuttered. The Scottish Review of Books has stopped publication. And it received an enormous amount of financial support from a public entity called Creative Scotland. And Creative Scotland pulled the plug on its financing because it was not diverse enough. And JC opines about that. No reasonable person would proclaim themselves opposed to diversity, but literary activity founded on social ideology always founders. It is poor practice, not to say Philistine, and it is impossible to ignore sinister historical echoes. To favor a writer principally on the grounds of identity approval is to risk injury to those who do not fit the criteria while casting doubt on the artistic ability of those who do. Ideology is harmful to art because it limits freedom, and when art isn't free, it becomes boring. And I agree with all of that. I agree with that 100%. So this is a very good issue. I will pull out that Making the Arab World and put it in my copy, although I don't agree with the review. But somewhere in here, to get back to the original point of this video, somewhere in here there is a poem. And I thought we'd go over it together. I thought that would be our poem for Poetry Tuesday. Now I just have to find it. I should have put a bookmark in the place, but you know, the uncomfortable reminiscence of the doddering and fumbling grandfather is kind of a feature of this channel, isn't it? Here we go. Okay, and part of why I picked this one is so that we can talk about this phenomenon, not just this poem, but this phenomenon, because you teach me a lot when we go through these things. It's down at the bottom here, and it is Armistice Day, 1918-2018, and it's in two parts. The poems are by Stephen Romer, and they're in two parts, numbered 1 and 2. And I want to know what you think about that. How do you approach a poem when you see that? Do you conclude that those two things are organically linked, that it is one poem in two parts, or is it two different poems? Because I don't see how these two are linked, and I want to go through them with you. They seem to be, the second one at least, seems to be about Armistice Day, and let's read poem number 1. So this could be two poems, or one poem that's connected in ways that you will show me. Part 1 of this poem. The poem only has one title, so maybe this is two parts of one poem. Part 1 is, on a dank day before the ceremony, in my grey-hunkered bled, I walked to the river and without a thought wished bonjour to a man in full hunting gear with a shotgun. That's part 1. And then part 2 is, they seem to find footage you have never seen, even when you think you have seen it all. This time of calves unloaded at Verdun, on their knobbly knees, fallen from the train. And those are the two poems. And I think, I mean, the mention of a ceremony in part 1 obviously applies to Armistice Day, I guess, if you know the title of the poem. If the title's removed, you wouldn't know. And I'm assuming the juxtaposition there is that the man in hunting gear has a shotgun, but that guns also kill people at the front. I don't know one way. I don't know one way or another, and I don't like the fact that a significant part of the punch of this section of the poem seems to rely on the fact that you know the title of the poem. The title of the poem is not part of the poem, or is it? You tell me. And then the second one is explicitly about World War I, with the mention of Verdun and of calves being brought to the front for food. I don't think it works quite technically, at least in a couple of ways. Calves unloaded at Verdun on their knobbly knees. I like knobbly instead of knobby. On their knobbly knees, fallen from the train. Something about that just doesn't work right. If they fell from the train, would they be on their knobbly knees? Maybe they would be, but the whole thing seems like doesn't seem right somehow. It doesn't seem right that I mean, are the calves unloading from the train like they were infantrymen, just one at a time onto the mud, or are they in pens, or are they in containers of some kind or other? Are they just being let loose off the train? And I'm not sure. I mean, Armistice Day 1918 to 2018. I'm not really sure. The title of the poem seems to stress that, the Armistice Day connection, and I don't really see that in either case. So here's a little poem. It's just a little thing. I'm sure it's not going to be in Stephen Romer's collected poems, or that it's a masterpiece of any kind. It's not, when lilacs last in the dooryard bloom. But I'm still curious to know what you made of it. I'll write down the poem down below. You tell me if you made more of it than I did. But it served two purposes, right? We got a poem to talk about, and we also talked a little about the TLS, which is always fun because it's my favorite book review. It's usually I mean, this issue maybe 30% not, but it's usually completely full of reviews of what my friends have always called Steve books. So, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. That is our Poetry Tuesday, but I'll be back. Thank you, Book 2.